all right? But first, some background. We can do this. Some background. We are now up to the year 1914, and Europe breaks out into a Great War. They called it the Great War. They didn't know it was going to be World War One because they didn't know there was going to be a World War Two. So it's the Great War. And Europe had broken down into two opposing alliance groups. There was the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the weird hyphenated country that had a single emperor and one foreign policy, but home rule for the Austrians and the Hungarians and the other ethnic groups that lived in that vast empire. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, the Central Powers they're called. And opposing them are the Allies, capital A, Allies. And that's Great Britain, France, and Russia. And they've promised each other, you attack, if somebody attacks you, we'll help you. If somebody attacks us, you help us. They've promised each other an alliance. And these two groups have great tension between each other. And in 1914, because of a spark, a Bosnian Serb nationalist assassinates the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. And Austria-Hungary is encouraged by Germany to be tough on Serbia. And the Russians, who are sympathetic to their Slavic cousins, the Serbians, will mobilize their army. Germany will mobilize their army. And it's really like a powder keg blowing up. It's like a vat of kerosene exploding. And Europe marched off to war. Now, why was it so tense? Well, there was nationalism, excessive nationalism in Europe. Nationalism means pride in your country. And pride in your country is a good thing unless you take it to an extreme and think that you're superior to other people that look just like you on the other side of the river, the other side of the mountain. There was militarism. All the sides were building up their armies. Britain and Germany were building up their navies. And you build up your military, eventually you might be tested to try it out, see what it can do in real world conditions. So you've got nationalism, you've got militarism, you've got imperialism. Because as you darn well know, the Europeans were carving up Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, and claiming territory for themselves. To heck with the indigenous peoples. And there were tensions over boundaries, and we own this mountain, no, you own this mountain, no, I own this mountain. And that tension over imperialism was transferring itself back to the capitals of Europe. And the entangling alliances between the Central Powers and the Allies. And what do you have? You have an assassination and a spark, and Germany deciding to do something they wanted to do for decades, and that is attack France. And Germany attacked France in August of 1914. Germany was mostly at fault for this war. I don't hesitate to say that. And they marched through a nice innocent little country, Belgium, and got into northern France, and their plan was to get down to Paris, capture Paris, and essentially cause the French to surrender and capture France. Some plan. Well, they got close. They got 40 miles from Paris, and in a last stand, the French were able to stop the Germans. And something happened at that point, 40 miles from Paris, that nobody expected on either side. And that is, both sides started to dig down into trenches. First, just little ditches, and then multi-story below ground. And they put barbed wire in front of their trench. And they set up machine guns. Both sides did this. Both sides did this. And in between, there's no man's land. And as I say, it's a stalemate. It's trench warfare. And it's unspeakably cruel and horrible. Because as we go from 1914 into 1915 into 1916 into 1917, both sides would attack the enemy trench. And the advantage was with the defense because of the machine gun. And these attacks would mow down men by the thousands, by the absolute thousands. And no side could really push the other one out of their trench. No side could make much forward movement. It's a stalemate. And this goes on, 1915, 1916, into 1917. It's a stalemate with thousands of men dying every day. And I'm not making this up. What did they do? They wiped out a generation of European men. They wiped out a generation of European men. Both sides. It's a stalemate. And where's the United States in all this? Well, this is where your paper begins. This is where you start your paper. The Great War is raging in Europe. And the United States wants to stay out of it. In fact, President Wilson, who was elected in 1912 to follow into the presidency William Howard Taft. You know about President Taft. Now we've got President Wilson. President Wilson and mostly all Americans want to stay out of this war. Why should we get involved in a European war 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean? Well, let me tell you something. American factories cranked up, American farms cranked up. The Europeans were desperate to buy all the American material they could. And actually, our economy did very well because of this war. We're Americans. Hey, show us the money. We're selling to any European country who's buying. It didn't matter what side they were on. As it ended up, the British blockaded Germany with their navy, and most of our goods ended up going to the British and the French. But the United States wants to stay out of this war. And President Wilson issues a proclamation of neutrality. Now, after 4 years, President Wilson is ready to run again for a second term in 1916. He tells the American people, we will stay out of this war. His campaign slogan in 1916 is, he kept us out of the war. And he will win a narrow victory in 1916 and serve a second term. Charles Evans Hughes, the Republican candidate, was a bit boring, but he came close. He came close. But President Wilson gets a second term, and a big reason for that is because he was able to brag that he kept America out of war. Well, here's really where your paper starts. America wanted to stay out of the war. President Wilson issues a proclamation of neutrality. He wins the election, promising to keep America out of the Great War in Europe, and that gets him reelected in November of 1916. And then in April of 1917, he's appearing before a joint session of Congress asking for a proclamation of war, a declaration of war, following the constitutional provision. What the heck happened? What caused America to go from let's stay out of this war to let's go into this war? And that's what part one of your essay is about. That is totally what part one of your essay is about. Listen to me. The first point that you want to make is Americans are getting propaganda. That's when you use your media to try and convince people that your side is right. That's what propaganda is. And the British and the Germans were using propaganda against the United States, trying to convince us that they're right. And the British did something very smart. They cut the German cable to the United States, and their cable remained operational. So we started getting only the British point of view, which was Britain is right in this fight and Germany is wrong. And that started to affect American public opinion. Something else that affected American public opinion is your second point. I think a short paragraph for each one of these 9 points really would work in part one of your paper. Now, your second point is there were German spies and saboteurs here in the United States. We're an open society. They just sent submarines over here and dropped them off in Long Island Sound. They paddled to the shoreline and took the Long Island Railroad into New York City. There were spies here. One stupid German spy left his briefcase on the subway. Somebody found it, opened it, and there were plans inside to bomb, to sabotage American factories. And in fact, a few bombs did go off in American factories, not doing much damage, but this hit the newspapers, and Americans are furious that there are German spies over here and saboteurs planning to set up bombs. Why would they bomb our factories? Because most of our goods are going to Britain and France, and Germany looks at Britain and France as their enemy. They didn't want Britain and France to get American war material. All right, your third point is the rape of Belgium. The Germans, to attack France, decided to march through a nice little innocent country called Belgium. And Belgium was very brave, even though they only had about 4 divisions and the Germans had about 33. The Belgians fought bravely and slowed up the Germans, and that was a factor in the fact that the German attack sputtered and didn't quite make it into Paris, stopped 40 miles from Paris when both sides began to set up the trenches. Germany occupied Belgium, and they were cruel and inhuman in the extreme. It goes down in history as the rape of Belgium. Yes, were there literal rapes of Belgian women? Yes, but the entire country was raped. And the Germans said to the Belgians, you fire on one German soldier and we'll take 50 townspeople, men, women, and children, and line them up and shoot them dead. Of course, the conditions were horrible, and soon there were real food shortages, and the people of Belgium are suffering. And Americans began to read about that and understand that as they read their newspapers every day. The rape of Belgium. Americans are really getting a bad view of Germany. German spies, now the rape of Belgium. Next, your fourth point, unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans called their submarines, which they've really improved so that they're a great weapon. Never before in history have they been a great weapon, but now by World War I, the Germans have them, nobody else does, and they really work. Below the waterline, hidden. They call them U-boats, Unterseeboots. That's the extent of my German. U-boats, unrestricted submarine warfare. These submarines start attacking American merchant ships. Merchant ships are ships that are not Navy ships. They don't have guns on them. They don't have guns on them. They're just carrying goods because Americans want to sell their goods overseas. And why can't we? Freedom of the seas. We're not in the war. We're not a belligerent in the war. The sides that are fighting are belligerents. Germans are belligerents. The French and the British are belligerents in this war. We're neutral. Why can't we trade with anybody we want? Well, you know, the time-honored principle of freedom of the seas says we can, but the Germans decided, no, we can't. They start sinking our unarmed merchant ships. So a bunch of merchant sailors from the United States sailing across the Atlantic, suddenly a torpedo hits their ship sinks in the Atlantic. The water's freezing. You can last there 7 to 10 minutes at the most in the water and you die. And Americans are outraged, absolutely outraged at the unrestricted submarine warfare, Germans sinking our ships without warning. All right, President Wilson will be furious, fire off a diplomatic note threatening to break off diplomatic relations, which, as you know, is the first step towards war. All right. The sinking of the Lusitania. The Lusitania is the Love Boat. It's a passenger liner where rich people go and enjoy their cruise. They're on vacation. There were many British people on this ship, well over 100 Americans. They're cruising off the coast of Ireland. They're playing shuffleboard on the deck. They're having a great time, eating fine food. Nobody thinks the Germans would sink a passenger liner, but the Germans did. A torpedo hits the Lusitania, the ship goes down, 128 Americans die, well over 1,000 British and other nationalities die. Outrageous, the world is shocked. Now we know that the British were secretly smuggling ammunition on the Lusitania, but nobody knew that publicly at the time, and the world is outraged and angry at the horrible Germans for sinking an unarmed passenger liner. The sinking of the Lusitania. You can see American attitudes going against Germany and in favor of the Allies, which are Britain and France and Russia. All right, here we have the Sussex Pledge, a French passenger liner. The Sussex was also torpedoed. And the outrage was such that Germany said, okay, we make the Sussex Pledge. We will not attack any unarmed ships without warning, okay? And that will temporarily keep us from war with Germany, the so-called Sussex Pledge. We're not going to attack any more unarmed ships without warning. All right. But in early 1917, Germany decides upon a desperate ploy, a desperate thing they're going to do. They're going to have one more final attack against the Allies on the Western Front, in the trenches. One more all-out desperate attack. We're going to push the British and the French out of their trench, capture Paris, capture France, win this war. And we have to stop the British and the French from getting U.S. war material. So they break the Sussex Pledge and start again sinking American merchant ships, which is unbelievably infuriating to President Wilson and all Americans, and we will break diplomatic relations with Germany. Now, at this point, something else will happen. One of the worst examples of American foreign policy, well, of foreign policy, not American foreign policy, but in this case, German foreign policy in history. The German foreign minister, Arthur Zimmermann, you know he's equivalent to the U.S. Secretary of State, will send a telegram or a note, sometimes it's called the Zimmermann note, to the German ambassador in Mexico City. Okay, you understand how that works. And British intelligence agents will intercept the message and turn it over to President Wilson, but also turn it over to the newspapers. And you know what the message was? The German foreign minister said to the German ambassador in Mexico City, talk to the Mexicans, get them in this war on our side. And when we win the war, we'll give Mexico back all the territory they lost in the Mexican War of 1846. California, the Mexican Cession. Remember we talked about that? Americans are outraged. The Germans are trying to get Mexico into this war against us. Unbelievably outraged. And then news comes that the Tsar, C-Z-A-R, the Tsar of Russia, Tsar means king, you can also spell it T-S-A-R, the Tsar of Russia abdicates his throne. When you abdicate, you quit. And he had to quit because he was overthrown by the Russian Revolution. And the Russian Revolution, we know, quickly ended up with Russia becoming a communist country. But at the beginning of the revolution, Americans and many people in the world hoped that Russia, many Russians hoped this too, that Russia would evolve into a democratic country. And we were very hopeful that would happen. And at least now, this horrible dictator king, the Tsar, was not in office. And now if the United States came into the war on the side of the Allies, the British, the French, and the Russians, we would be joining countries that were going to be democratic or were already democratic. We were kind of joining the good guys. And by the way, the German word for king is Kaiser. And the Austro-Hungarians had an emperor, dictators. We were joining the good guys, Britain, France, and now Russia, with the Tsar gone, could be considered one of the good guys that was heading towards democracy. So the Tsar of Russia abdicates. Now, the ninth point you want to make, I just wrote a $sign up here. We're sending lots of war material to the Allies, beginning in 1914, 1915, 1916. And the Allies quickly ran out of money, and we started giving them credit and giving them loans. And the fact is that if the Allies lost the war and Germany conquered Europe, there was no way we would ever get our money back. Now, President Wilson couldn't say to the American people, we have to help the Allies because we don't want rich Wall Street investors and bankers to lose their money. But Wilson understood that. American businessmen understood that. There was a financial motivation for the U.S. to save the Allies so they could pay us back all the money we loaned them. 9 points that you make in part 1 of your paper. Propaganda and the British cutting the German cable. So we're getting British propaganda primarily explaining their side. German spies and saboteurs. The rape of Belgium. unrestricted submarine warfare, the sinking of the Lusitania, the Sussex Pledge, broken. And during all this, President Wilson sends his best friend, Colonel Edward House, to try and negotiate with both the Allies and Germany, and then nobody took him seriously. Nobody was interested in diplomacy. The Zimmerman telegram, a horrible insult to the United States. The abdication of the Tsar, and now we're going on the side of supposedly democracies, and the money overhanging all of it. We needed to get our money back. At least the rich bankers did. 9 reasons why the United States went from wanting to stay out of the war to, in April of 1917, going into the war.